All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to our third webinar in our series for the Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative as part of the South Carolina Energy Office's work here. This one is going to be focused on the power of stakeholder groups, and we're really excited to have a robust discussion around this. My name is Jen Weiss. I am a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute. We are helping to facilitate the discussions for this project with the Energy Office. I'm joined today by my colleague, Allie Garrett. And so we are going to be kind of behind the scenes taking some questions in chat, but if you have any trouble along the way, please reach out to us through the chat. Just real quickly before I turn it over to Sarah Basemore, wanted to just let you know that the webinar will be recorded, and then you can always watch it at your leisure. But please keep your lines muted. We will have the chat function open to do questions, and here and there we're going to stop and pause for questions where you can unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like. But other than that, please keep your lines muted, and we will be rolling along. For those of you that aren't familiar with the EV Stakeholder Initiative here in South Carolina, I think most of you probably are, but in the event that you aren't, this is a project we've been working on since the beginning of 2021. And the purpose of it is these three objectives. We want to be looking at the legislative and regulatory environment surrounding EVs and EV charging station access and adoption across the state. And then we've started to work together in working groups to identify different challenges and their accompanying opportunities for EVs and EV charging stations so that we can increase the amount of EVs that are in the state and develop some recommendations around this so we increase the EV penetration. And so what we are doing within the working groups has sometimes spurred some questions about how do we prioritize, how do we work together as stakeholders. And so the webinar today is focused specifically on that. Before we turn it over to Camille and to Smitty, I wanted to let Sarah Basemore give you an introduction and welcome.
Thank you, Jen. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sarah Basemore, and I serve as the Director of the State Energy Office. We are pleased to partner with the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University on this stakeholder initiative. As you know, the purpose of the initiative is to facilitate a broad, collaborative statewide discussion among stakeholders to explore opportunities for EVs and charging infrastructure deployment within South Carolina. And then, as Jen said, after identifying challenges and developing opportunities, we can put these recommendations to the Joint Committee on the Electrification of Transportation in the General Assembly. We're excited to kick off our third webinar. My understanding is they have been well attended and provided a forum for further exploration of the complexity surrounding this evolving issue of EV. I want to remind everybody or clarify about today that this is not to be confused with South Carolina's process. We are learning from what has been done in Texas, and so we will learn from what they have done and hopefully reap some benefits that'll benefit our stakeholder process and answer some questions. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rap.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I wanted to elaborate on that last point. You know, RAP is a nonprofit, and we are philanthropically funded to provide technical expertise on many subject areas, including transportation electrification. And as such, we've been fortunate to be able to have kind of a bird's eye view into a number of state processes throughout the US and other regions as well. And in so doing, we were able to give a presentation in Texas and met Smitty, who I will introduce you to here momentarily, and really were able to see their process and have a window into that opportunity. And so what we wanted to do is bring some examples of how they did exactly what you guys are kind of focusing on doing right now, just narrowing in on what do you do on EVs, because there are so few penetrations of EVs nationally now. So this is the tip of the iceberg. We're going to be talking about this for many, many years. So the thought process behind bringing Smitty here to talk about how they are starting in Texas to talk about these things and will continue is to think about different things to think about as this is a long-term endeavor for all of us as we look at how to do this cost effectively, equitably, as we electrify transportation. So with that, it is my deep pleasure to introduce you to Tom Smitty Smith. And he has served in the past as the state director of Texas Public Citizen. And he was in that role for over 30 years. And Public Citizen is a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization that champions the public interest. So in this role, he was a key leader in developing policies that resulted in Texas' renewable energy boom in the 1990s and early 2000s, which given the amount of wind in Texas is a considerable success. And he was an internal architect of the Texas Emissions Reduction Program, known as TERP, which we'll talk about a little bit more here. And that addresses air quality in Texas for non-attainment cities. But since 2017, Smitty has shifted his focus to help Texas transform into an electric transportation leader. And he is TxETRA, his group that we'll talk more about here in a minute, first executive director. And he also serves as on the national board of Plug-in America. So Smitty, talking about your renewable energy experience, you've told me in the past that there's some lessons from renewable energy that are applicable to EVs. Can you tell me more about that?
As you're well aware, Texas is not a particularly progressive state. And when we began to really have a discussion about bringing renewables in as part of our deregulation bill, we in the environmental community had tried for more than a decade to get some sort of a goal for renewables or pilot projects for renewables put together. But it wasn't until we really started sitting down and talking to the renewables companies themselves, the people who wanted to develop wind in those days and solar a little bit, and said, so what is it that you guys are going to need to really make this market work? We pulled together a series of working groups and developed a list of the big 5 things they were going to need to get put in place in terms of goals, in terms of financing, in terms of developing transmission infrastructure that were going to be necessary for them to be able to make renewables profitable in Texas. And then we sat down and looked at the political landscape. We as nonprofits couldn't fund the 4 hire lobbyists that were going to be necessary to do this work, but the big companies could, and we as nonprofits could raise the funds that were going to be necessary to do the background studies and the analysis. So we married those things together. And we focused on those things we agreed on. And we discovered that all of our expertise together, we agreed on about 90% of how to solve the problems. There was 10% we didn't, and of those 10, we decided that what we would do where we didn't agree was to sharpen the questions so that the answers we got from the legislature or from the regulators really resolved the problem far better than allowing or relying on some 20-year-old staffer in the legislature or somebody at a junior level in the bureaucracy to develop statutes or regulations that missed the mark because they simply didn't understand the problem. And that was successful. And together we finally were able to pass a goal that puts Texas now in the leadership in the state and the country rather, in terms of renewable production, and in addition has made us number 5 in the world in terms of renewable energy. It wasn't everything the enviros wanted or the consumers wanted or the industry wanted, but it was a good compromise deal.
Thanks. And I think you've used this experience, obviously, as you have thought about EVs, right? And you've done that through the vehicle of TxETRA. And I'm going to put a slide on the screen which shows a little bit about it. But can you tell us a little bit about what TxETRA is?
Yeah, we're an organization comprised of that's designed to do the policy necessary to accelerate the growth of renewables in electric vehicles in Texas. And it's utilities, charging companies, manufacturers, enviro and consumer groups and equity groups that have come together and meet on a monthly basis as a whole, and then on an as needed basis in subcommittees, much like you're proposing, or working groups to put together the individual policies that are needed to electrify transportation in Texas.
So as you mentioned, this is a really diverse group. It's a big tent, right? And as you know, as every state, there's numerous examples you can take on EVs because there's not a lot of things regulatorily or legislatively on the books, right? So there's way too many things that we can do all at once. So with this broad group of stakeholders, how did you get them to focus on which policies you wanted to start with?
We looked at a couple of different metrics. We're not the first state to have done electrification policy. Depending on the analysis you read, there are 26, 28 states that have gone ahead of us. And so we asked RAP and other organizations to help us analyze what were some of the common themes. But we also looked at what was unique to Texas and what kinds of opportunities we had in Texas to utilize existing programs to help with vehicle electrification, like our Texas Emission Reduction Program, which is an incentive program primarily designed to reduce NOx, but has consequential benefits on the other pollutants, including climate change as well. And then we also did an analysis. We sat down of what the regulators thought we needed to do. We went and talked to the chairman of our Public Utilities Commission, who said, yeah, this is a big deal whenever I go to national meetings about how we're going to electrify the grid and what we need to do to assure that large quantities of electrified vehicles don't tank the grid. And in addition, we also need to, when they all charge at the same time. And we also looked at our internal definitions of what is required in terms of allowing companies to operate charging stations without running afoul of the law and having to become registered as electric utilities. We sat down and had similar conversations with the chairman of the environmental agency here, with staff over at the Texas Department of Transportation and the executive director of the agency that license professions and also continue and does licensing and inspections of gas pumps. And from all of those, we then came up with a laundry list of each of the, what the agency heads thought were going to be necessary, and put it all up on spreadsheets and had a wide-ranging conversation one afternoon and came up with the things we thought were going to ultimately be most important. And then I think, as Camille mentioned, and as others have mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, we realized this was going to be a relatively long process. We weren't going to come up with all the solutions and all the answers right off the bat. So we needed to think about what the first steps were going to be. What were the most important things to put in place first? And then what could we come back in subsequent legislative sessions and develop, and what was also in the works at the federal level that we could put into place at a later time once those rules or regulations were ripe. So that's how we developed our list of goals.
So, Smitty, I also have heard you, as you were going through this process of figuring out what other states have done, what you wanted to do in Texas, you also asked kind of a series of questions here. What kind of policies are needed to make EVs work in Texas or in the state that you're in? Who's in charge of the EV action, which is going to vary from state to state? Is there any money any pots of money that can support actions within the state? Again, it varies state by state. And then who does the work? You mentioned TDLR for licensing, et cetera. Can you talk more about, like, as you went through those questions, what it kind of revealed to you or helped you drill down on?
And you did a really good job, Camille, of sort of outlining the questions we asked. But the other one that we asked was the fundamental political question of who's going to be helpful to us and who's going to oppose us. So there are some state agencies where we knew we were going to run into morasses because they're bureaucratic and were going to be a nightmare to work through these kinds of policies. And others, like the Public Utilities Commission or the Environmental Agency, who are generally pretty encouraging of our work and were willing and would be publicly in a position to say, yeah, this is important. We need to get this policy in place as soon as possible because it takes a while to build the charging stations. It takes a while to really get the technologies in place or to fund the grants that are going to be necessary to develop the grants and get the money out there that's going to be necessary to develop the charging infrastructure. So those are some of the other criteria we looked at as well. And then there was the political question. Where was this bill going to go? And how would our choice of a committee or sponsors going to affect that? And it was pretty clear this was going to go to the Transportation Committee, but it also had elements that might take it over and put it into an environmental committee. And for a variety of reasons, when we actually looked at the politics of it, we decided we'd be better off running it through a Transportation Committee and selected the chairman of the House Transportation Committee and the vice chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee, who both were interested in this. But what always turns out, for those of us who have been around a long time, it's the staffers that were key. And they had interested staffers in this who had already done a lot of reading and thinking about vehicle electrification and were willing to take something like this on.
So, Smitty, what you're talking about here is legislation. How did you know that this group needed to band behind a legislative action versus regulatory or other method?
That's a really good question, Camille. And let me go back, and we've sort of skipped over one of the other steps that we took fairly early on when we got this group together. We sat down and asked the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission if she would open a docket and hold a series of workshops and to get a lot of information about what it was going to take to do vehicle electrification in Texas. And she agreed. And so we had a workshop opened and had plans for a series of in-person workshops. And then COVID happened, and well, things went awry. But so what ended up happening is, as opposed to having in-person workshops, there were a series of questions asked by the PUC and 3 rounds of comments that ended up really helping to define what could be done regulatorily and what was going to need legislative fixes within at least the purview of the PUC. But that process ended up giving us a pretty good idea of what the communities beyond TxETRA thought and helped us figure out what we could accomplish internally through regulations, through conversations, through other policy strategies, and what it was going to take legislative action to resolve. So that gave us a pretty good sense of that. And then when we looked at the menu of options that we had put up there, questions, we then began to pretty quickly analyze that there were things that were going to require fixes at various departments, at transportation, at the licensing department, at the Public Utilities Commission, and then at our environmental agency, and then the agency that registered vehicles and collected road and bridges taxes. And so we began to make silos of what would go into each of those policy initiatives. Did the process once again of saying, what can you do without legislation? And then began to put together a legislative initiative.
So I want to come back to TxETRA, because TxETRA wasn't banded for the legislative action or the regulatory action. It was a group of people interested in EVs, and you've had conversations with your monthly meetings throughout this whole process as you developed the questions and different people that you talked with. How did you incorporate the TxETRA group into getting this information as you talked with, it sounds like, numerous different agencies?
We, as I mentioned, there's a variety of different parties and groups of attendees. We've had a meeting every month, sometimes several times a month. And we've had over 200 people attend. Typically, it runs about 55, 53, somewhere in there, that attend these monthly policy meetings. And so what we did was took a different cast of characters depending on what agency we're going to. So we would take the charging companies and go off and talk to TDLR, and we'd take
Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. So they license and regulate gas stations in Texas and would be the equivalent regulatory agency for EVs, should they wish.
Right. And then we went off and talked to Department of Motor Vehicles about fees, and talked about took people who sold vehicles with us, and similarly went to the environmental agency. We talked to those people who were likely recipients of grants and so forth to electrify their fleets or their ports or their gas stations. And so we got an opportunity in each of those cases to get the people most affected in front of the right people in the agency. And then that was particularly helpful in terms of allowing the agency to see that we had significant expertise that enabled them, as they were proposing incentive programs, to write the incentive programs in ways that were far more targeted at what the real problems were, and used technically sophisticated terms that enabled the potential grantees to know what they were talking about and figure out how to fill out the forms with ease and with the least difficulty. But it also got to the real problems that as we took the charging companies in, they would say, we don't have any real problem about putting a charging station in at a high volume place in urban Dallas, where we're going to get a lot of charging. Where we're going to need grant money, or at least a match, is out in the rural areas of Texas along the lonely interstates, or in underserved areas in rural communities, or in low income or moderate income communities, or apartment homes. That's where the band's not going to come until we get charging stations out there and people begin to realize they can rely on it. And that really helped the agencies develop their various strategies around electric vehicles, is to have a group like us that provided them with experts that they could rely on, and who were in the various businesses.
And these experts and people are part of the stakeholder group. They're part of the, this big group of 200 or so people, varying amount that attend the meeting, but they were able to come with you or other TxETRA staff to have these conversations, elicit the information, and as you said, figure out the holes that existed.
It was a mutual deal because the agencies could use us to fill in the holes, and in that process, we could then figure out where we needed to do additional legislative work. So it was mutually beneficial to all of us. And they knew as we were going in that if there were things they needed legislatively, they're being state agencies, they can't go off and advocate at the legislature and say we need this change in law, but that's our role, and we could and we did. So it was really a good mutual kind of process that oftentimes happens, is we create these kinds of stakeholder groups and then go out and work with the agencies around implementing and developing policy.
So you've done your internal focus, looking at the things that you wanted as a group of stakeholders. You've brought in experts to help define what that is, looking at what other states have done. Then you've also done your homework by talking with the agencies and then figuring out the holes of areas that would need authority, either regulatory or legislative level. So with all of that backdrop, what did TxETRA decide to pursue legislatively? Out of all the things that are out there, what was in the EV omnibus?
So we put together something called the Electric Transportation Act that had basically 5 components to it. The first one, and the one that, as we have done research and that if you all have read the trade publications, the biggest reason people are afraid to buy electric vehicles is range anxiety. They're concerned about getting from one part of the state to the other, from Houston to El Paso, or Borger to Brownsville, from the northwest to the southmost corner of the state. And so we put together a provision that said we want to develop a border-to-border charging station network that not only is along the interstates, but gets rural communities so we don't have another digital divide, or into the low income communities, and also helps with evacuation, because about a third of our state needs to evacuate periodically as a result of hurricanes or wildfires or other weather related disasters. Another big plank was the question of fees. This is something that the folks at ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the people who build roads are very concerned about, is how do we make sure that electric vehicles pay their fair share? And so we put a fee plank in there that initially started out that after a study done last session, or required last session, came back and it said $100 is what the average internal combustion engine car pays in state fees. So that was our initial suggestion. We had a program that expanded the state incentive for electric vehicles to include pickup trucks, because after all, this is Texas, and about half the vehicles in Texas are pickup trucks, or trucks of one way or another. That does include some SUVs that are registered in that way. We also had a provision in there that provided for the licensure of electric vehicles, because we were beginning to see many urban communities starting to scratch their head and seeing a void in what standards they ought to use to permit an electric vehicle charging station, and coming up with weird rules that were beginning to cause heartburn among the charging community, because they have different standards in Austin and a different standard in the suburb of Austin, and it was just driving people nuts. So we wanted to come up with a way of standardizing that and reassuring people that these things were uniformly and well regulated. And last thing we needed to do was change the definitions to assure that these charging companies and the act of selling electricity weren't considered something that needed to be regulated by the PUC as if it were a utility. And that was the easiest of all those things to fix. But it was a big deal to the charging companies and their investors. So we put this together in an omnibus bill. We approached a number of members of the legislature, including one of them who later became the Speaker of the House, who said, I'm in favor of having a single omnibus bill, because with this session coming up, we're not going to have time to debate 5 or 6 different measures. And if we have one bill we can do on the House floor, that's a whole lot more efficient. He, by the way, was an oil and gas guy, or is an oil and gas guy, and said, I'm in support of electric vehicle legislation because the change is going to come. And we need to prepare for it, and we need to put the infrastructure in place so we're not left behind by comparison to other states. And so his office became a place that did quiet advocacy on our behalf and opened a lot of doors for us. And that was a very big help. So there was a lot of that sort of stuff that went on.
So Smitty, it was an omnibus bill with those 5 areas, and TxETRA voted on this, right? So this is the charging companies, consumer advocates, this is everybody had to vote on this. How did you mentioned before kind of like a 90% rule, that you got 90 agreement on, was it all of those things, 90% agreement for what you put in the bill? What you were able to put forward to the legislature had the backing of this diverse group. So can you tell me a little bit more about the value of that?
Yeah, so we went through a process similar to what you guys have on your working strategy of having stakeholder groups. And so we had one group that did charging policy, one group that did PUC legislation and so forth. And then they worked out with the help of a lot of folks who are gifted in writing legislation, the language that they would like to see. We kicked that around 2 or 3 meetings and eventually came to a point where we asked people to vote on each of the various planks. And one of the things that we did was we gave people the opportunity to make corrections, of course, as they went through, or make suggestions for modifications. And so we asked people, do you have any objection to this language being submitted for drafting and then for inclusion in the bill? And what we found was that there was really virtually no objection. What was in the bill, however, was that to which we could get an agreement. And what was not were oftentimes some of the details. To give you an example, one of the most contentious areas was around how much and how quick to regulate the charging stations and the infrastructure, and the questions of what kinds of standards for the software, and how often you might need to update the technologies. Those were contentious issues. We agreed on the fact we wanted this agency to do the regulation. We agreed they should go out and inspect them periodically. We agreed that there would be standards adopted when the feds develop, when the National Institute of Standards and Technology it mounts their final regulations in 2024 or whenever. But there were about 6 different things we did not agree on. We put those things we agreed on in the bill, and we then very clearly delineated in that working group those things we did not agree on, and then tried to sharpen that question about, does a charging station need to be replaced every 10 years to assure that we're using the most modern technology? That was a question we left up to the legislature to decide. And eventually the sponsor of the bill said, yeah, they should be replaced. They should be an evergreen assumption that we need to replace technology, so we're not leaving a charging station that no longer works someplace out in the field.
So once you have identified the omnibus, you've agreed on the issues, you said you identified the champion who is the chair of the transportation committee. It wasn't just the bill. There was other elements of things that you did with this. Can you talk about what else your group provided and tried to raise?
So one of the, you don't pass legislation unless there is public demand for that legislation. And so there are several elements to that. We have an organization, nearly 1,000 people that are members because they drive electric vehicles and have contacted us, and that number grows on a regular basis. And then we have a lot of associated groups in every community. There are electric vehicle associations of one stripe or another. There are the Sierra clubs. There are the various associations of automobile engineers that are all fascinated by this technology, made presentation after presentation after presentation. I think I one time counted that we had done over 50 presentations in 1 year over Zoom, thankfully, to these various organizations. COVID significantly reduced the amount of time I spent driving around the state. And built up public support in that way. We also did a lot of press. We had 21 stories in the state of Texas about electric vehicles, how quickly they were coming, and what kinds of legislative changes needed to be made to facilitate that. We even had an article in Forbes in Mexico talking about maybe this is something that Mexico ought to consider looking at as well. And we held a series of legislative briefings with candidates for the legislature. And then we did what groups like ours do, which was we encouraged our members and our policy members, group members, to go talk to the legislators before the session began to make sure that they believed it was a big issue. Another strategy we used was we hit the legislature with relatively frequent materials talking about electric vehicles, how rapidly they were going to come. We did Zoom calls with legislative staffers. We did a series of policy papers that were typically about 4 pages front and back, so it looked like that were both distributed by email and subsequently to the Capitol reopening distributed by hand, that were graphically interesting and kind of sucked you into the story as you open them. And we also began to take a look at who were prominent donors in the communities that we knew drove EVs. And so up in a heavily Republican district in Dallas, one of the most influential Republican members of the legislature said, oh yeah, all my friends that go to the country club drive Teslas. And I realized, oh, this is a whole different market than most of my typical environmental or renewable work, when the country club crowd is out there promoting electric vehicles, and the Republicans recognize this as now as a status thing that they want to help move along.
So I want to leave some time for questions here, Smitty, but can you tell us what happened this session, where you're at in your trajectory.
So one of the other things that I wanted to mention is, before we get into where we are and where we're at, is that as somebody who's now been organizing for 40 years, there are a couple of lessons I want to share with you. One is early learning is Noah didn't put every animal on the planet in the ark. He limited the number of animals he took and limited them to 2. So when developing legislation, there is a rule about legislative attention spans that basically say you can usually do a 5-point plan. Anything beyond that gets beyond the comprehension of the legislative process. The people who are literally dealing with 8,000 bills a session to be able to keep sort of oversight over, really figure out what's going on. So don't overload the deal. And then the other is you need to have a really quick tagline, opening line. Electric vehicles are cooler, cleaner, and cheaper. Worked really well for us to sort of summarize why people were promoting them. And depending on the audience, we often started out with cheaper. Having these quick taglines worked really well. So we got the bill filed, we got it heard in the House. We ended up having 4 components of this bill separated out, and they became separate bills. This is part of a strategy we typically use to make sure that if the main bill gets shoaled up, you then have something else you can carry your bill on and add other provisions on it too. So in all, what ended up happening is we got the PUC bill passed without objection very quickly. The registration bill that would require EV things got through the House or through the Senate and got to the House. The EV fee bill got to the House floor and was at the very end still pending, and then got killed on a point of order at the very last minute, and became a far more progressive bill because we got to a vehicle miles traveled strategy rather than a flat fee. And so we got a lot of the various components of the bill actually out and into the House process. Our big bill got killed in the calendars committee, and the bills that we tried to attach components to it died in the last hours of the legislature, with the exception of the PUC fee bill. But the good news is that we're now at a position where everybody in the legislature now recognizes that electric vehicles are a big thing. It was helped significantly by Tesla deciding to move a big factory to Austin, and the tremendous amount of press that engendered. And it was also helped by some of our colleagues releasing reports talking about all the jobs in the electric vehicle industry. And then the election by President Biden and the push to do a lot of electric vehicle policy, and the Biden administration has helped. So where we are right now is we are beginning to, after this session, look at preparing for the next session. And in Texas, we have interim committees that are tasked with doing things over the basically be robust debate in these interim legislative committees. We have had a significant crisis in Texas because of the big freeze and the roughly a week that we were without power in February. And we have taken the question of, will electric vehicles make the power problems worse, and flipped it around with a lot of help from our media experts to know they would be actually helpful and the announcement of Ford that they're starting to build electric pickup trucks and advertise in their advertising, the first attribute on their website is that electric pickups can help power through storms, has turned what might have been a problem into an asset and a reason why people might consider doing electric vehicle policy an important thing. And that announcement sort of really stirred up a lot of positive press for us. So we're moving on. We're starting to have those those post-session, what do we want to do next now meetings? And we're having people call us up saying, in the legislature and in the regulatory agency saying, well, this has been fun. Let's figure out how we're going to keep working together and what our next strategies are. So we're accelerating into the future, and we're expecting that Texas will have a large component of the solutions to that. It will be different than most states because, after all, we are Texas and we're weird. But it's we're expecting to have some success in the next session and some interim success at the regulatory agencies and in these interim committees. So that's, be more than happy to answer any questions you may have now.
Thank you. And Allie and Jen, if you wanted to take off the spotlight off of us, I welcome some questions as people think about how this could apply, or questions on strategy.
While we're waiting for questions, you got them?
I wanted to highlight one unique aspect of Texas, and that is TERP, the Texas Emissions Reduction Program.
Yep.
Which was a funding source for some of the EVs as well. Can you talk about that? And perhaps, I guess the question is then in South Carolina, what funding sources are available in this way? So if you could talk about TERP.
So the Texas Emission Reductions Program was a program created in 2001 to reduce the emissions of nitrogen oxides. And it was initially focusing on off-road vehicles, all of the earth-moving equipment and the diesel backup engines and water pumping equipment and so forth that are used throughout the United States, and figuring out a way to replace those old dirty engines with newer ones that emitted less NOx and fine particles and carbon dioxide and so forth. And it's now grown to have programs to incent electric vehicles, for example, or energy efficiency, all of them oriented to reducing pollution. It's funded by a variety of fees, some on the lease or sales of diesel equipment, but also on vehicle registration in urban areas that are the most polluted. And it's altogether moved about $2 billion in 20 years into clean air programs in Texas. And it has become the model for the diesel emission reduction program at the federal level. And a lot of states have similar programs where money is collected from in a variety of ways are used toward emissions that are plaguing their urban areas. While we're paused, let me say something about the role of the Regulatory Assistance Project and other backup groups. RAP has been wonderful to us in helping develop policy, analyze what else has been done elsewhere, and in developing the policy papers. But there are probably, and I can't speak more highly of them. They're really been wonderful. There are a lot of other allies that are working in this space, some who focus in on large fleets like those of metros, transit agencies, the port electrification, school bus electrification. There's a group called the Alliance for Transportation Electrification that works with electric utilities primarily. And so reach out, because that group of folks has been particularly helpful in providing us with monthly speakers on a variety of different topics, but have been particularly helpful in developing models or finding the best models used in other states for various things. So that can be a big tool to you all as you go through your process.
Hey, Smitty, it's Jen Weiss, and I cannot tell you enough how much we appreciate you taking the time to share this story with us. It is incredible to me. And I know it was not easy and it was a lot of work. And so my question to you is, I mean, we've got a group of 100+ stakeholders right now that are engaged with the South Carolina work, representing many of the organizations that you have within your group. What would be, I mean, the result of this is going to be a report that has some recommendations, but certainly we want to move those recommendations forward, even coming up with our own omnibus bill at some point. What would be your recommendation for how these stakeholders should continue working together, banding together to come up with this bill and keep the momentum going?
Well, it's pretty simple, really. Each of those stakeholders has a problem that they want to see resolved, and coming up with a process where you sit down and you do just what we often do in problem solving exercises. What are the big problems? And having people go through and say, what are the 3 biggest things you think you need to be resolved to make this work, or to really accelerate it? And then that becomes a scatter chart. You have some very interesting ideas, but you seem to have a cluster of the problems that people think are going to need to be resolved. Once you get that process going, you got a pretty good idea of who are the people who are going to be necessary to pull together to really do the thinking about what those resolutions are. So again, charging companies had their stuff, the electric utilities had their own list of things, the manufacturers had their list of things, the dealers had their list of issues. And it becomes a pretty good idea. And then there are the people that you need to get involved in each of those cohorts. So the consumer groups, for example, needed to be involved in resolving a lot of the questions about disclosures that needed to be made when somebody was plugging in a car, and how you needed to know pricing information, and what kinds of things you needed to know about times of use and how that might affect the prices. So, you know, it's a no-brainer, really. It's just figuring out the process and then charting it out over a series of meetings over the course of the next several years. And not everything is urgent. And coming up with strategies of what are we going to do first order, what are we going to do second order, what are things we can leave until the feds act or other states have come to a consensus is also a good metric to use.
Yeah, great. You make it sound so easy. Yeah. So we've got the scatter chart right now. We're trying to work on what you're just talking about, the prioritization of it. So yeah, thank you. We'll follow your lead and know that it can't happen all at once. I know there are other questions out there. Anybody else want to just either, unmute yourself and ask a question, or ask one through chat while we still have Smitty on the line? Oh, I do have a question. So David Gelman asks, you said 4 of the planks were broken out into separate bills. Which one dropped at that point? Will it come up again?
So the one that dropped at that point, dropped out, was the environmental plank. And that would, to give it a little bit more description, basically change the funding amounts slightly. And we have typically a $2,500 incentive for somebody buying a new electric vehicle at the state level. And we wanted to increase that for pickup trucks to $4,000. And that was because when you look at emissions per mile, we figured the fastest, the most important thing we could do to change the market was to get pickup trucks cleaner as fast as possible. And in addition, pickup trucks are typically more expensive than a passenger car. And certainly the first round of pickup trucks are going to be about $20,000 more expensive than buying an electric sedan today. So we wanted to make sure that happened. Plus, we're gifted by having GM and Toyota manufacturing trucks here in Texas. And we figured if we put the money on the table, maybe they'd manufacture the trucks here. And we could benefit economically from bringing those jobs and technologies here too.
Yeah, and I think David has a follow-up to that. So go after the pickups first. Go after the pickups first to make the biggest difference in Texas. Great idea. Any chance it comes back in a future session?
Yeah, that was actually a fairly popular plank. And the manufacturers were reluctant to tip their hands. And this is bizarre stuff that has to do with financial politics at a level far beyond my ken. But basically, GM didn't want to say, we're going to build here in Texas. It has union consequences, it has financing consequences, and so forth. And Toyota had similar but different reasons for not wanting to tip their hands or make any announcements at this point. 2 years from now, they may be crawling all over us saying, yeah, we'd sure like that incentive, especially if they were there to only limited to those things that were made in Texas. Tried that. We know it's unconstitutional or violates the Commerce Clause or something. So can't do that, but we expect there will be some permutation to that we may be able to figure out a way to do legally.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I think I like your long-term vision too. We know that not everything's going to happen at once. So we could come back in future sessions and try again with a different group of stakeholders or the same stakeholders that have just learned a little bit as they go along, right? And certainly economic development is big in South Carolina too. So we've had a lot of discussions around how do we increase that? How do we bring more manufacturers and suppliers into the state as well? But there's already quite a few that are here. So that's been great. I think we have time for one more question if anybody has it. Again, feel free to unmute if you'd like. All right, Smitty, any parting words of wisdom for us?
Sure. Like any journey, this has got a lot of mileposts, and we're going to be, we know that over the next several years, we're suddenly going to go from 200 models worldwide to 500, and that the price of the battery is going to drop down to where it will be cheaper to buy an electric car than an internal combustion by 2025. And so we're in a position where we need to get the policies in place before the boom really starts. So we have the luxury of time. We have the luxury of other examples, both in the United States, but worldwide. And so we have this limited window, but we have the opportunity to get it right. One of my earliest mentors in the legislative business said to me, you're never going to get it right the first time. You're going to end up, but it's better to be partially right than to have never acted and get it all wrong because you failed to act. And over the years, I've been doing this about 40 years, and the 20-something years since we passed the renewable energy bill or the TERP bill, we come back in every session and we tinker with it, we perfect it. And one of these days we're going to get it right. Or as one of my friends said, you know, it's an evolutionary thing, Smitty. None of us stay the same. Things change, and it'll never be perfect. But it's better than having done nothing at all. And one of the exciting things about this industry is how fast the technologies have changed and are changing. And so we're in a position to take advantage of the buzz that's happening out there about electric vehicles and to share the excitement and say, and there are certain things you got to do. It's like paving the highways. You got to get your foundations in place before you start to put down the concrete. And that's where we are in this process right now.
Yeah, incredible. And I love your optimism about it too. Just keep going, keep trying, keep pushing it, and it will happen. Smitty, I cannot thank you enough for joining us for this hour and sharing all of your great words of wisdom and all the things that you've gone through in your stakeholder group to get to where you are. We wish you the best of luck in Texas to continue the progress that you've made. And certainly we will probably be in touch again to learn more from you. And so appreciate you. And Camille from RAP, thank you as well. That was a wonderful fireside chat. I really enjoyed that format. Haven't done one of those in a while, so that was kind of fun to do we'll have a fireplace behind you guys next time. But thank you to everybody who joined us today. And again, the recording will be online if you'd like to rewatch it and or share it with your colleagues. And just thank you all for being a part of this initiative. Have a great rest of your day.